This is Yesterzine, the monthly magazine show about monthly magazines. We take a magazine from the Golden Age, play the games they liked most and least, and flip through to find out what gaming was like when Rare still released games. Quite a lot of games, in fact. We're going to see several of them just in this issue. The issue in question being the Nintendo Official Magazine issue 70 from July 1998. And it works out well for Rare, because while the gaming heaven is one of their classics, the gaming hell is not their fault. Our cover feature involves one of theirs you know, but probably not like this, and another future classic gets a preview. These games stand out though. We're less than 18 months into the N64's UK life here, and I know it's the summer lull, but the official magazine can only muster up 5 reviews, and of those, only 2 of them are system exclusives. Alongside our heaven, the only one is Video System's ill-considered attempt to turn Sonic Wings into an Ace Combat beta. This compares poorly to the 15 in official PlayStation that month, and even the Sega equivalent had 6 if you generously let them count their advance reviews of foreign releases. That said, things were looking vaguely promising in their news section, where Sega's magazine was openly dreaming of the Dreamcast being their saviour by this point. The N64 had some stuff coming. Alongside a game we'll look at later, Rare was showing off Perfect Dark for a '99 release. I'll admit to not having played this one, and there's not time now, but they talk it up massively compared to the classic GoldenEye on which its engine is based. Hope or expectation? We'll find out another day. What certainly didn't turn out better than GoldenEye was the Mission Impossible game. But at least the N64 was still getting the big licenses, because this one never made it to Saturn. Equally, EA Sports had long since stopped any Sega support for good, but they were still interested in the N64, promising a new Madden. Rayman is coming across from PlayStation, and just to join the party, Sony themselves get into N64 publishing with a version of Wipeout, which you could argue just shows how little a threat they considered Nintendo by this point. But yet, Nintendo still had Rare, and Rare had... The N64's launch period was better than most. In any normal console generation, Wave Race's hugely advanced water physics and Pilot Wing's 64's stunning vistas would have done it on their own. Having a Star Wars license worked for the SNES, and while Shadow of the Empire wasn't quite the game Super Star Wars was, the N64 still came out of the gates at speed. And of course, the next 6 months would see the small matter of GoldenEye. Strong. And we've not even mentioned the plumber in the room. The N64 version of his kart game may not have had entirely universal acclaim, but his platformer certainly did. When we looked at it in the 3 greatest games ever showdown right back in the entirely different universe that was 2019, it won. But it was fair to say time had done some damage to its control scheme, and the signature N64 textures were looking their age. We mused a proper Switch remake would probably be the second best game on the system after Mario Odyssey, a game that feels more like a Mario 64 sequel than anything that came between them. Nintendo were apparently half listening, and a year later Super Mario 3D All-Stars appeared, containing a remake of Mario 64 that had as much effort expended on it as My Christmas Cards. And then they stopped selling it because of reasons, only to release the original again recently on their online service, where Nintendo Life still ranked it the 4th best of the 16 or so games provided. We of course joined the story 18 months after Mario 64, and no matter how good that game was, everyone with an N64 had by now rinsed it and wanted more. Nintendo themselves didn't have more. They were desperately trying to finish the by now spectacularly late Zelda Ocarina of Time. An Ocarina of Time well spent as it turns out, of course. Ocarina tops that Nintendo Life list in fact, with its sequel close behind. Nintendo turned elsewhere though, to long-term collaborators and then second-party developer Rare, most recently responsible for making a SNES do things it should not have been capable of with the Donkey Kong Country series. They created a new character. 2 in fact. A bear called Banjo and a bird called Kazooie, and the result is a 10-page 95% review. First though, this provides a good example of how the generational leap was already causing games to have more ambition. Because here's the intro to Donkey Kong Country on this Nintendo. Banjo's intro is in many ways similar, but it's just a little bit more. And that's just the attract sequence, because there's a whole plot intro too, which spends a lot of time to tell you that a girl's been kidnapped. At least this time it's a sister and not Mrs. Banjo, but still, it probably didn't need this much attention. Actually, is there a Mrs. Banjo? Is it Kazooie? I always hoped those two would get together. But anyway, focus, because it's time for the most exciting part of any game. The thing you've been looking forward to. It's the tutorial. It's a fairly involved tutorial, teaching you several moves, some obvious to those of us from the future, such as the concept of a double jump, and some very much part of this game, such as the Flying Bird Mega Peck, as I'm calling it because I've forgotten the name the game gives it. While it gives you the choice of not doing the tutorial at all, once you start it, then you're gonna finish it, because the mole isn't going to repair the bridge until you do, and Kazooie can't fly. Yet. So keen is it to make sure it's absolutely explained everything that some of these abilities don't work until the mole explains them. Maybe it's because the concept of a 3D platformer was still at least a little new for Nintendo owners in 1998, but I've never seen a game so keen to make sure it's gone over literally everything to you before there is any danger of some fun breaking out. And to be fair, this game does have a lot more of that stuff than Mario 64 did. Once we get through the tutorial though, then we start to steal more things. Mario 64 controlled access to levels based on the number of stars you'd collected from the various tasks in its worlds, and Banjo does exactly the same with its puzzle pieces, or jiggies, apparently. These are absolutely not going to be the only collectibles. The main ones are the music notes. There's 100 of those hidden in each stage, and they act alongside stars to stop you getting into areas if you don't have enough of them. The first gate of which occurs after World 1, and requires 50 of them, a device that means you're going to have to explore at least a little bit. In doing so, you're also going to learn some more moves, and while you don't yet know it, the lack of the first one would also prevent you from even reaching the first note door. Kazooie comes into her own with the ability to drag you up steep hills. Also exploring lets you spot some of the lovely bits of attention to detail in the game, such as the way the music changes when you go underwater. There's a lot to do here. There's 5 puzzle pieces and 100 music notes, of course, but even after that there's 5 skulls, which can be exchanged for exciting magic, and even these weird dinosaur things to rescue. There's also the expendable ammo of eggs for Kazooie to shoot at things. Which brings me to my first issue with the game. It specifically talks about your best number of musical notes from the level as being the one that counts, and it does that for a reason. If you revisit a level, for instance to try and find those last 11 notes you missed on the first run through, then you'll find the entire thing is reset. If you want to beat that 89, you're going to have to collect that 89 again. And all the dinosaurs. At least the 2 persistent and spendable ones, the skulls and the puzzle pieces, you get to keep. It feels like a reminder of how old this game is though, the kind of thing a modern game just wouldn't do to you. Speaking of things a modern game wouldn't do, the constant jokes about the mole's glasses from Kazooie get old very quickly, and hopefully wouldn't find a place in a modern game. And it's probably fair to say the same should be said for the entire character of Mumbo. Speaking of Mumbo though, he's a helpful chap. Find him and you can buy the ability to use his magic, which in the first level involves transformation into a giant termite. This doesn't sound like the world's most useful ability, but termites can run along waterbeds and straight up those steep hills, which makes at least some of the notes easier. I strongly suspect the 11 I'm still missing are somewhere I haven't worked out that only he can reach. So if Banjo's game design is still broadly on point, what say the tricky matter of 23-year-old 3D platformer controls? And the answer is sort of. The range of moves is comprehensive, but you'll soon be chaining them together like a pro. That sheer number though does sometimes mean you make mistakes, and the camera is not always your friend, even with the era-correct move and auto-center controls. You will find yourself sliding off the edge of platforms, heading in near random directions underwater, and flapping uselessly at the edge of places you should totally have been able to land on. Whether that's going to become a serious problem in the endgame, I can't tell you yet. Traditionally, Yesterzine shows you only the first hour or so, in order that if you decide to play it, I haven't given the game away, both figuratively and literally. Here though, I want to show you some of World 2 to test if the imagination level is maintained. It's here that Kazooie finally gets to fly, adding yet another collectible in the form of the feathers that act as fuel for this, and adding a whole new dimension to the camera issues. But basically, it's got just as many little hidden bits as the first world, so I'm going to presume for now that that at least continues. I mentioned Nintendo Life put Mario 64 at number 4 on their list for the new Switch N64 service, with the two Zeldas topping it. If you've ever watched this show before, or have any sense of narrative continuance and callbacks, you'll have noticed I did not mention what number 3 is. This is number 3, above Mario 64. And that's a tough call. Certainly though, especially if you opt into that service, you should play this to decide that order yourself. It's probably the original collectathon, and while tarnished a little with age, it's still a collector's item. And for some people, it's got more memories than just another plumber game. Kate, whose extensive list of credits includes third cyclist of the Apocalypse in some show called Yesterzine, is an OG fan of Banjo, and she'd like to explain why.
As a child in the 1980s, unlike duds of Yesterzine, I only had one console. It was the N64, and there only existed 2 games in my tiny world. One of these was the Ocarina of Time, and the other was Banjo-Kazooie. Because of this, it holds an extremely special place in my heart. So much that when I was asked to review this game, I almost couldn't describe why I love it so much. It's just the truth. Partly it was because it was the first game I ever played in 3D and it totally blew my mind. And partly it's just so dang fun. Every aspect of it, from the cute little characters to the fun moves they do with the bird on the back, and something that really awoken the interest in collecting every possible thing there could be. It really just sealed the deal for me in how I play games still to this day.
So a success for Rare with Banjo and Kazooie. It was the 10th best-selling N64 game of all time, and everything that beats it also has at least one of Nintendo or Rare involved. It would ultimately outsell titles like Wave Race and Majora's Mask, although to be fair, by the time the latter was released, Japanese gamers had their hands on a PlayStation 2. But where to next? Or rather, Rare to next? No? Okay, yeah, that's more of a Larry Bundy joke, isn't it? He'll let himself out. Well, unsurprisingly, there was a straight sequel. Banjo-Tooie appeared towards the end of the N64's viable life and became the second best-selling of the post-millennium N64 releases behind Majora. But in the meantime, they needed another character platformer. Something nicely on brand to cover the fact that Nintendo EAD were all Zelda all the time. Luckily we're covered. This issue has the preview for a lovely looking game called 12 Tales, starring a cute little squirrel called Conker, and an even cuter chipmunk by the name of Berry. The information is scarce, but the game is going to be a dual genre game, acting like a platformer when you're controlling Conker, and some sort of adorable Tomb Raider puzzle thing when you're controlling Berry. These characters were already familiar to people. What was then called Conker's Quest and Banjo-Kazooie had been announced together at E3 in 1997. By November, both characters had appeared in their first game. The game was Diddy Kong Racing, which is one of the few games starring Nintendo characters that Nintendo didn't publish. While it remained an N64 exclusive until a DS port a decade later, Rare self-published this one, and most of the characters were theirs rather than property of the Big N. It took Diddy Kong Racing a while to get there. The game somehow started life as a strategy game called Wild Cartoon Kingdom, that picked up a Disney license and became a racing game. Then lost the Disney license, was briefly a sequel to their seminal NES and Game Boy RC Pro-Am games, and then eventually acquired the Donkey Kong license as delays to Banjo's own game meant this one would be doing the heavy lifting for Rare at Christmas 1997. There's a theme here though, because you're absolutely going to tell me you never played the 12 Tales of Conker. And I'm going to believe you, because it sailed past its Christmas 1998 release date without looking back, and when it finally emerged, was something very different indeed. In 2015, Rare shared some footage on YouTube of the game in its original form, and we see a demonstration of what Nintendo officials were talking about and why they were so impressed with the facial expressions on the characters. The video also reveals that part of the reason for the changes the game is about to go through were the sheer number of cartoon platformers on the system, including, of course, their own one we just looked at and its rapidly approaching sequel. So into hibernation goes the 12 Tales of Conker, but the character wasn't sleeping. A year later, we did get a Conker game on a Game Boy and Game Boy Color dual format cartridge. It was fairly poorly received, although N64 Magazine's pronouncement that the game improves massively from its dismal start illustrates the other reviewers probably haven't even played it as long as I have. Nonetheless, it's still a relatively cutesy thing with the same obvious plot as every other cartoon adventure. But still no sign of 12 Tales. Right up until as late as 2001, when the game re-emerged for release as Conker's Bad Fur Day. And it's changed. It's really changed.
Stupid logo. Yeah, that's better. You can get it. Marvelous.
There probably aren't many games, especially ostensibly cartoony platform games, that begin with you waking up nursing a terrible hangover. But that is exactly what happens here. If you're not giggling about how daring they are being using teenage humour on a Nintendo platform, it's going to leave you a little cold, and this won't be the last time we're going to need to say that. Because the thing is, what you've done is got me wandering around such of the world as it's letting me access at an incredibly slow walking speed and with no jump to speak of. Meanwhile, Conker constantly repeats his stock of 3 complaints about the situation. If you don't work out immediately that you need to walk all the way around the fence to find the gap and instead try to go swimming like I did, then it gets really tedious. A chat with our blind mole equivalent, a scarecrow called Birdie, solves the issue, introducing us to the context-sensitive item boxes that give you whatever you need at that point in time. In this case, booze for Birdie. But for Conker, on the other side of the booze curve, there's this game's equivalent of a fried egg chili sauce and chutney sandwich, which cures him right up. It's the same tutorial mechanic as Banjo then. Prevent you accessing places until it's good and ready for you to do so. Unlike Banjo though, there is no way to skip any of this tutorial, which is a smidge irritating because they're basically an adaptation of Banjo's moveset. That said, it also feels worse than Banjo immediately. I know I'm on an emulator here, so there will always be an element of lag. But this is the exact setup I used to capture the Banjo footage as well, without having those issues. Even in the tutorial mode, there are several jumps I miss and platforms I blunder off through what feels like unresponsive controls. I wonder if they're just asking the N64 to do a smidge too much. Where it does share with Banjo is the trick of moves not working until you learn them, which screws me over as I reach the top and get pounded into oblivion when punching the bridge troll. Visiting the one other room in the level, Conker suddenly remembers he's holding a frying pan because this game is always the one to take the most monkey cheese option available. Having used that to beat up the key and escape, it can also be used to dispatch said troll. It gives us time to survey the scenery though, and in stark contrast to Banjo at this point, it's so far very much embracing the grey-green-brown colour palette, an aesthetic not helped by the N64's tendency to smear it everywhere like it's a toddler looking for attention. While considering if that joke was a good idea, we're interrupted by one of what are already becoming some very frequent cutscenes in this game. While it's impressive they managed to do this on a game that was originally distributed on cartridge and is only 64 megabytes in size, it's also a bit much. The game realises this by breaking the fourth wall early on to let you know you can skip them, if you've already watched them. It's at this point something resembling the game starts, and our first encounter is with a bee who's had her hive nicked by a group of wasps. We got a task to retrieve it, and it turns out the game does not want us to kill the wasps. You must read its mind and just swipe the thing back and do a runner. We screw this up the first time by blundering into the mud and dying, at which point we discover that even the concept of lives apparently requires a cutscene. That done, we're nearly ready to move on. All we need to do is use our newly acquired slingshot to dispatch these baddies, a task that would be made much easier for me personally if the game didn't have enforced inverted camera controls. It's a classic old game mistake, of course. I remember having arguments with people about this 20 years ago. Probably the same people who think games shouldn't have difficulty levels and that bosses are a good thing.
That way.
In any case, this at least allows us access to the grounds of Pooh Cabin. And like your mum on a Saturday night, entrance to Barn Boys, which we will stay in just long enough to showcase some game design. Here's the first guy we encounter.
I say, little fella, you better get this fat-ass bitch off of my back pronto.
Lovely. But the point is, he wants rid of the burping mouse, the height of sophisticated comedy. And the way we're going to do this is going to fetch cheese. You might well have tuned out for this though, and assumed this is a game of tackling enemies rather than fetch quests. And indeed, if you smack the mouse with the frying pan, it looks like it's doing damage. This is bad game design. If you see something appear to damage something, you assume it is damaging something. In reality, we could do this all day if we liked and achieve absolutely nothing. So we go to fetch cheese, which isn't exactly a huge brain power job. We have to work our way up, past a couple of blocks with predictable jump patterns, and if you fail that jump pattern, it's likely to squash you twice before you can do anything. And then it's tricksy. When you pick up the cheese, you can lose it again by daring to take the quick route, by getting squashed, or even just by taking a bit too long, perhaps because you were waiting for the predictable jump pattern to work itself out. But okay, we get it back to the mouse and he eats it, and wants another, which you get the same way. No difficulty change, no difficulty at all really, since you already know the process, and then it wants a third, the same way. And this is the problem with Conker really. I think you can detect that, to put it mildly, I do not vibe with its lazy attempt at puerile humour, despite the fact I have made both a poop and your mum joke myself in the last 5 minutes. But even if you did, then the simple fact is both its controls and the overall game design has regressed in the 4 years since Banjo, and regressed noticeably. Which leaves Conker with very little point to its existence, which is probably why it sold less than 1 million, and while there was a third Banjo game on the Xbox 360 and the character endured, we've seen nothing new from Conker other than an original Xbox remaster. Rare left the character, and this game, in the age of Kasabian and invading Iraq, and I'm afraid I suggest you do the same. So Rampage then. It's a 1986 arcade game by Bally Midway, who, depending on your age and location, you may know for distributing Space Invaders and Pac-Man, or for creating most of the best pinball games in existence, or maybe just for a small game called Mortal Kombat. Rampage is legally distinct from any other monster franchise you may know about, and stars George, a large gorilla who punches buildings, eats people and plays ping pong with planes. You've been watching the arcade version, but predictably Rampage got ported. Here's the one I tend to play, on the Master System. It's fun, but even in 1988 when this port emerged, the arcade game was considered a slight experience. It was a nice way to while away a few 20p's, featuring the kind of destruction you didn't get in many games of that era, and generally over fairly quickly. A home port of that for 30 quid felt somewhat content free though. It's not a game that stands a long playthrough. I mention this because of our gaming hell. A full decade later, in 1996 for the arcade and 1998 for the Nintendo 64, Midway Games and Sapphire decided that what the world really needed was a direct sequel. And they thought we'd want to spend £45 on it. You're certainly not going to be spending £45 on that attract loop. I'm not muting this, there's actually no sound. It jumps straight to that title screen and badly rendered high score table before showing the world's least attractive and shortest glimpse of the actual gameplay. I'll save you a bit of time. I have checked and it's identical to the arcade machine, although they've at least added the sound for the gameplay part of the demo loop. But that's setting the scene immediately. This is a no-nonsense, no-bones about it, completely 1-1 port of the arcade machine with no real frills or additions. It is not going to be a high-effort production. It really, really isn't. I left it on the options menu briefly while I took some notes about how the controls certainly haven't moved on in a decade and how you could probably still play this thing on a Master System. And as I did, the game grabbed focus back and went on to doing the attract sequence as if I'd walked away from an arcade machine. So look lively, chaps, let's play a game and enjoy this quality acted intro.
While it's true that there have been no serious side effects reported so far, I think we need to stop production before...
Well, they've pre-rendered everything, because that's a hallmark of a high-quality game. But otherwise, there's very little to say immediately, other than that I'm playing Rampage. Like, literally. It probably doesn't help that I followed directly on from playing the old Sega version, but I am doing the same things with the same buttons here. It's even immediately got that irritating control oddity from Rampage. You frequently punch up rather than sideways, for instance, because you're trying to climb a building at the same time, and the game all but ignores the C buttons that could have been used to alleviate this. You can't jump between the sides of buildings. If you try to punch sideways when low down on a building, he frequently dismounts and buggers off across the screens, which now scroll because who needs to see how far through a level they are? Other than the scrolling, these are all issues in the Master System version of a game a decade older.
Clearly the creature's goal is to wipe Scumlabs from the face of the earth.
Between levels, you at least get an update video of the progress of the situation from implausibly proportioned Science Lady, and a fairly detailed update of your score, produced in the optimistic misapprehension that you have the slightest clue exactly what you're doing. In theory, this is, as the game implies, a world tour, but the changes are slight at best. We'll get to the London level in a moment, but the buildings still look like New York tower blocks with ranks of external air conditioning units that are considerably more rare in the UK. It's a missed opportunity to really brand the levels, especially these early ones, which are likely the only ones you'll ever see. There's actually a subtle branching level mechanic at play here, but why bother when everything looks pretty much the same? A mercy-killing approaches though. It's notable, when I go to level 3, that Scientist Lady has stopped doing plot, and the reason for that becomes obvious immediately. This is as far as the game wants me to get. The difficulty immediately spikes, and I die twice basically as soon as I join. You can see the health counting down. This N64 version, incidentally the only home conversion that actually supports the 3-player mode from the arcade, also appears to have infinite continues. So I power on a little, and it basically continues in this vein, throwing more and more at you. Arcade machines do tend to want you to actually pay your way to a degree, although this is certainly worse than most in that regard, but you would think for a home conversion that they might have put the barest attempt into difficulty smoothing, since you've already paid your 45 actual pounds and are entitled to see at least some of the 130 levels they incredibly thought was worth making and including. None of this should really be a surprise. The whole Rampage World Tour project appears to be a case of barely lifting a finger on Midway's part. This game was the last evolution of a Texas Instruments based arcade hardware configuration that had been around since 1985. It had been used by Midway as far back as Narc. It's the same chip behind all the 2D Mortal Kombat games. There was no attempt to push the envelope here. And while it was still a pretty strong system in 1990, when Atari used it to move arcade driving games on significantly with hard driving, When this came along, the best part of a decade later, Sega were introducing their Dreamcast-related Naomi board, which made driving games look a little more like this. It was well past the glory days of a system which dated more from the era of the ZX Spectrum. As we know, Nintendo official were also not impressed. When a magazine whose ultimate background aim is to promote a game system throws out a 53%, you can pretty much divide it by 10 when converting it to, say, Amiga Power. And their review just says it should have been left back on the end of piers where it belongs. I'm not disagreeing. At £45 this was an insult. They wanted you to buy this instead of Mario 64, or Banjo-Kazooie, or Wave Race, or Pilot Wings, or GoldenEye. In 1988, a no-bones port of an arcade game was remarkable just for its existence. In 1998, the industry had moved on, and there's no excuse for this being released on its own at full price. They knew this, of course, because in 2004 it got another release as part of a pack of 20 games, including Narc, and 2 of the Mortal Kombats, and Hard Driving, come to that. Some of you may have that compilation, and hey, why not drag it out and play this? It's still Rampage, it's still fun for 5 minutes, as Rampage always was. But if you're going to do that, I'm not sure you're not better off just going with that Master System port. At least it's been mildly home version tuned, feels more of its time, and doesn't hate you after level 3. On the back page today, a curio. The Shapeshifter 2, a classic style adventure for the original Game Boy. Currently on Kickstarter, where, depending on your budget and hardware, you can choose to pledge for ROM images or cartridges. Wait, cartridges plural? Yeah, this is a game so large it may be the first multi-cart game for the Game Boy. The choices you make will affect the gameplay and story, and may well involve you switching cartridge and putting in a code, because Game Boys don't remember so good when you take the cartridge out. And while you're enjoying that, you can enjoy the code wheel, manual, and extra special double-sized box it'll all come in. It's an ambitious project this, but Green Boy has released several Game Boy games before, and if anyone can pull this one off, it's them. You'll find the game and this trailer on Kickstarter via the link below, and the campaign runs across most of the month of November. Funding isn't a problem though, it hit its target in 8 minutes. 8 minutes, of course, being 7 minutes and 55 seconds longer than it takes to click the subscribe, thumbs up and bell icons, and about 6 minutes longer than it takes to leave a comment explaining to me exactly why they thought charging £45 for Rampage World Tour was a good idea. £45, of course, is slightly more than they will charge you for a full 2-cartridge expansive Game Boy Adventure game in 2021. And with that neat piece of loose end tying up, we'll see you next month. Ta-ra!